center Black lives, Black history, and Black placemaking in K through 12 classrooms, that can be a mechanism by which to address the inequities that have been perpetuated by systemic racism, cultural and educational colonialism, and the folklore of white supremacy. And in that spirit, we also think it's important that we acknowledge that while the scope of our project is focused on researching and better understanding the history of land loss and Black placemaking in the 19th and 20th centuries in DC, there's also a history of displacement that precedes the establishing of Black communities in the land that now constitutes the city of Washington. And so we want to acknowledge that the territory that we are going to be talking to you about today, which Corey and I will refer to at different times as the city of Washington, historic Washington County, and or the federal district, that all of those sit on land that used to belong to the Nacotchtank and or Piscataway peoples. And we invoke those legacies and honor these ancestors and their current day descendants who continue to reside in this area as we open this virtual space. So let's get started here. As I was saying, Corey and I are thrilled to join you today as community organizers and public historians working with the Black Broad Branch Project, which is researching and documenting the history of a thriving community of freedmen that lived along Broad Branch Road in the upper Northwest, beginning in the mid-1800s. The picture featured here on the left is, it depicts the land plots that comprise the community known as Dry Meadows. And this community of small, Black, family-owned farms offered its residents a sanctuary from the lynching systems of nearby Virginia and rural Maryland. And it also offered its residents a relative freedom from racial codes that governed the federal city in early 20th century. By 1929, so from 1840 is where we can document that they've been there. By 1929, these families were displaced from their land through the weaponization of the use of the power of eminent domain and racially restrictive covenants for the purposes of building Lafayette Elementary School and its surrounding park. And our project was fortunate enough to track down the eight current day descendants from two of the families in this community, the Pointer Harris family and the Brenham Dorsey Shorter family. And our specific model for participatory action research is comprised of three main components: traditional historical research, oral history methodologies, and theories of reparations. And each of those components involved input from our descendant narrators, and were all oriented towards advocacy to achieve meaningful redress or reparations. As I was mentioning, Corey and I first became involved in the project as student oral historians with the University of the District of Columbia. And I think it's important to mention that UDC's original iteration was the abolitionist minor school for colored girls. And the spirit of abolition, of liberty in its fullest extent, is the very foundation of the culture and epistemology of the political science program at UDC. Both of us have since graduated from that program, but we remain committed to striving towards meaningful redress for the descendants of Black Broad Branch. And today we're joining you not as educators with specific prescriptions for what to do in the classroom, though as of December, we do have that available to folks. But rather today's exercise is to engage you all in making an argument for how the historical narratives illustrated in Black Broad Branch can be equipped to pursue repair for racial and economic inequities that have been present in the development of all of the city of Washington. And really, ultimately, our goal is to provide you all with the historical narratives and timelines that can help you understand that the landscape of Washington, DC, its current demographic and economic distributions, they're not accidents of nature. They are the result of systematic and state-sponsored discriminatory policies, coupled with deliberate efforts to remove and restrict African Americans from certain spaces, and understanding how that legacy was built is necessary towards trying to build strategies for equity today and beginning to envision strategies for equity in the future. And we're going to do that today in three main sections. First, Corey is going to give a historical overview of the formation and development of Washington, D.C., with a parallel history of our two families whose stories really illustrate what harms incurred by systemic racism can look like and how they can look like throughout generations. Second, we're going to do a breakdown of reparations, in which we will make a case for education as a vehicle to pursue reparations and why it has an important role in efforts aimed at social and restorative justice. And we'll also be reviewing how we came to this conclusion. And lastly, we hope to have a large group discussion in which we explore how incorporating this history in the classroom through participatory research practices can meet the goals of reparative justice and the principles of Black Lives Matter. Before we dive into the history portion that Corey is going to be walking us through, I did want to mention that we have put together a list of resources related to oral history, reparations, and we've linked them in a document which you can access through this QR code. And we hope that you find these useful as you begin to consider how you might incorporate this type of work in your own endeavors. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Corey.
Wonderful. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Mariana. The story of this community along Broad Branch Road is one that centers the values of family and freedom in the face of insurmountable obstacles. To get there, ancestors were forced to endure sacrifices that would ensure the longevity of their lineages. The story of these two families at Broad Branch begins with the original ancestors who were heavily involved in the affairs of the first president of the United States, George Washington. I'll begin with the birth of the original ancestor of the Dorsey Shorter lineage, Caroline Branham. Branham was born enslaved at Mount Vernon in 1764. She was a dower slave of Martha Washington from her first marriage to Daniel Parke Custis. Caroline was responsible for tending to Martha's needs, preparing beds for the Washingtons and any guests of the estate. She was also a skilled seamstress, often making bed linen and clothes for other enslaved people on the estate. By 1788, she was married to an enslaved man, Peter Hardiman, and had already had 2 children. 11 years later, after having served his time as president, George Washington passes away. At his bedside during his final days is Caroline Branham, tending to his every need. The death of George Washington meant that Branham, her husband, and her children were inherited by Martha Washington. However, 3 short years later, Martha Washington passes away. With her death, Branham and her children were inherited by Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. Caroline's son, Austin, who was fathered by George Washington Parke Custis, eventually got married to a woman named Estelle and had 21 children. The 21st child was Wilson Antipholus Branham, born in 1858. When he comes of age, Wilson marries his wife, Frances Henry, who was born in Arlington, Virginia. Wilson's father, Guy Henry, was deeded property by George Washington Parke Custis on his Arlington estate. It eventually became known as the Guy Henry Tract. Wilson and his wife would go on to raise their family on this tract for the duration of their marriage. Wilson and Frances would go on to have 5 children, 1 stillborn, 2 boys, and 2 girls. Shortly after the birth of her 5th child in 1886, Frances Henry passed away. With her death, Wilson departs from Arlington, leaving the children behind and remarrying. Wilson Branham would eventually come back and take his 2 daughters, Rosa and Sarah Branham, and leave them in the care of his widower's sister, Laura Dorsey, and her husband, Robert Dorsey, of Howard County, Maryland, in 1883. The Dorseys bought a plot of land and built their house on Broad Branch Road in a community then called Dry Meadows. She and her husband farmed their plot of land and sold fresh produce and other household wares to the community. In 1884, Robert Dorsey filed a permit to build a 1-story extension to their home. Laura Dorsey was the Black community's grocer, and was the Black community's grocer, May used the extension of her house to sell those goods. Laura and Robert Dorsey's nieces, Rosa and Sarah Branham, were raised on Broad Branch and attended school there. Eventually, Rosa would go on to meet and marry a gentleman named Richard Delozier Shorter, and together they would have 5 children. The children would oftentimes play on the land and camp out in the backyard under the stars. Now, as I mentioned, Both familial lineages have direct ties to George Washington. As you might know, Washington's business affairs as owner of the Potomac River Company often led him to visit construction sites in Great Falls, Maryland, and the surrounding areas. These sites were supervised by white laborers and manned by enslaved Black people. The original ancestor of the Poynter Harris family is one of the enslaved people responsible for building George Washington's personal canal into the federal city. His name is George Poynter. Poynter is born enslaved in 1773 near Great Falls, Maryland. At the age of 13, his enslaver, William Wallace, who is also believed to have been his father, began renting him to the Potomac River Company. As a stipulation of his lease, Poynter was allowed to earn portions of the wages that a white laborer otherwise would have been allowed to make. In 1792, at the age of 19, Poynter purchased his freedom for $300. Shortly after obtaining his freedom, he married a woman, Betty Townsend, and bought land in which he would build a cabin. For employment, Poynter was hired by the Potomac River Company, for whom he would work for the rest of his life. George and his wife, Betty, had 3 children. All 3 children were raised on the plot that George had purchased upon his manumission. The eldest, Elizabeth, leaves the family acreage in 1820 and moves on a plot of land that's adjacent. Her brother, William, comes of age and moves to the town of Georgetown. The middle child, Mary, stayed on the family acreage and had married a man with the surname Plummer, having a daughter whom she would eventually name Mary Ann. However, in 1820, Mary died. Her parents and her siblings cared for her daughter, Mary Ann, for the rest of her adolescence. Mary Ann would rotate between the family farm owned by her grandparents, her aunt's residence in Montgomery County, and her uncle's home in Georgetown. In July of 1824, the C&O Canal Company was set to break ground on the canal that would connect the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River. By this time, George Poynter had ascended to Captain George Poynter, supervisory engineer for the Potomac River Company. It was his task to ensure that all parties attending the groundbreaking ceremony, including sitting senators, congressional representatives, the mayor of Washington, and President John Quincy Adams, made it up the river safely in his fleet of canal boats. Present with him on that day was his granddaughter, Mary Ann, who had been 8 at the time. At the helm of the ship for the duration of their journey was 8-year-old Mary Ann, guided by her grandfather. In 1829, Captain Poynter pens an impassioned letter as a proposed revision to the path of the canal would result in the destruction of his home. In his letter, Poynter protested the construction of the canal. Relying on his life of service to President Washington, the compelling nature of his story as a free man, and the value of his reputation, he made a bid to save his home. Despite his efforts, Poynter's cabin was taken and destroyed after he and his wife passed away in 1834. The inspiring story of his greatness in that point of American history was erased. However, the spirit of determination persisted through his surviving family. His granddaughter, Mary Ann, was staying with her uncle William at the time. In 1837, she left her uncle's residence and married a man by the name of Thomas Harris. While they were looking to buy a home in Georgetown, rising racial tensions at the outset of the Nat Turner Uprising forced them to look elsewhere. In 1840, Mary Ann and her husband purchased a 2-acre plot of farmland in Dry Meadows. Their neighbors were Laura and Robert Dorsey. Their residency is in the Federal District's rural Washington County. Now, in 1861, Abraham Lincoln is sworn in as the 16th president of the United States. A month after his inauguration, the Civil War begins. As the war rages on beyond the capital city, the Harrises and Dorseys remained largely insulated for some time due to the Civil War era fortifications like Fort Reno. 4 days after the Battle of Gettysburg, Mary Ann Harris's 2 eldest sons, John and Joseph, went off to enlist in the war effort in DC's 1st Regiment U.S. Colored Troops. There is additional indication that members of the Dorsey household also went off to fight in the war as well. Now, jumping forward about 29 years, 1890 marks 2 important moments. For one, Mary Ann Harris and her husband have been married for 52 years. This is a clear demonstration that they and their wedding had outlasted the life expectancy at the time, likely due to their increased quality of life. On the other hand, the Chevy Chase Land Company was formed in 1890. The land company was founded by Francis Newlands, who was determined to build the city's first suburban subdivisions marketed towards affluent white people looking to escape the crime and bustle of the federal city. Newlands used his company to quietly purchase thousands of acres in Maryland in the federal city. His new subdivision would be called Chevy Chase. Newlands would begin by extending Connecticut Avenue into Maryland and begun development there first. He helped finance some of the first electric streetcars in the federal city, giving folks from the rural areas of Washington and his new subdivision access to the nation's capital with relative ease. The development of the streetcars were vital for then Mary Moton's husband, who was a cobbler. The development allowed him to travel to Georgetown to work and make a profit. However, in the early 20th century, it became very clear that these new conveniences were not intended for the largely African-American community of Dry Meadows. As Newland sold homes, they contained racially restrictive deed covenants, barring the sale of the property to African-Americans. By 1919, both families were surrounded by single-family lots owned by white residents. They were an African-American community within a white enclave. The only thing missing from this segregated space was a park and a school. In 1928, through the use of eminent domain, both families were compelled to sell their homes and land for the equivalent of about $200 each. Amaya, if I could get you to go back to 1890 really quickly, I'm going to walk us through these maps so that folks can kind of see what is taking place. I want to take a brief moment to provide a visualization of how this community, formerly known as Dry Meadows, eventually was erased. This map shows the community of Chevy Chase in 1890. What you're seeing here in the green circle is the African-American community of Dry Meadows. The triangle in that circle is the 3-acre plot that was purchased by Mary and Thomas Harris in 1840. At the time of the purchase, the land owned to the north of them and across the street were plantations that held African Americans in bondage. The square outlined next to that triangle is the plot of land that was purchased by Laura and Robert Dorsey in 1883. This map also depicts land purchased by the Chevy Chase Land Company far to the west. Now, jumping forward to 1913, you can see it becomes very clear that development is occurring in the immediate vicinity of these two families. More critically, the single-family lots being created overwhelmingly contained racially restrictive covenants, barring the ownership and residency of African Americans on said property. Now, by 1919, the Harrison Shorter families are nearly surrounded on all sides by racially restrictive lots. At this moment in history, it would be nearly impossible for either of the families to buy land or a home in the community that they have called home for more than 20 years. The Chevy Chase Land Company has also developed their subdivision to the west of the family acreages. After years of lobbying local officials, local and federal officials, in 1928, the families are compelled to sell their homes and property to the federal government. From there, the families scatter in search of affordable home ownership opportunities across the East Coast. Having spoken at you all for so long, I'm going to turn you all back over to Mariana.
Sorry, folks, just struggling to unmute here. Okay, so the timeline that Corey has just presented to you all now is the result of both traditional historical documentary research along with the oral history interviews that we conducted of our descendant narrators. We used these oral history interviews to both capture the generational implications, including the harms that were incurred because of the loss of their land, as well as to ask our descendant narrators to articulate what meaningful redress, as defined by them, would look like in this instance. And the final product of the initial phases of our project was to come up with a list of recommendations of reparations in practice. And by combining traditional historical research methods, including genealogical research, archival research, along with those oral histories and the reparations theory, we were able to come up with a model for reparations that we dubbed the ACE model: acknowledgement, compensation, and education. We detailed that process and our recommendations for each of those categories in a report which we presented to the descendants in historic Chevy Chase, DC in summer of 2020. In turn, the descendant narrators in September of 2020 gave us a list of their priorities within those recommendations. And from their feedback, we learned that the #1 priority for them were the recommendations that were included under education, which is why we've spent the last year and a half trying to come up with ways that we can increase public education and awareness about the history of these families, including efforts to present at DC public schools. And most recently, we partnered with Georgetown University to develop curriculum that adheres to DCPS standards, and that can be used at the 3rd grade level, the 7th grade level, and the 12th grade level. And part of the reason that we believe that it's so important to include increased public education about this history is that understanding their generational history of these two families is actually a great vehicle for understanding the dynamics that shaped Black placemaking in Washington, D.C. as a whole. And then from a very practical sense, it's also a necessary step for us in helping to create the political momentum that is necessary to achieve some of those bigger goals in the categories of acknowledgement and compensation. As Corey illustrated for us in his timeline, the Washington that these families were navigating back then provides the context to the Washington that looks like today. Unlike today, where we live in a sprawling metropolitan city, in the late 1800s into the early 20th century, most of the District of Columbia was considered to be rural farmland, and the federal city of Washington itself was contained to what we today know as the L'Enfant Plan or downtown DC. The remaining area within the district, contrary to popular belief that it was swampland, was actually comprised of mostly tobacco and dairy farms and many other cash crops. Some of these farms were large plantation enterprises, as Corey showed us, but others were smaller family-owned operations. And many of those family-owned farms belonged to formerly enslaved people who had achieved their liberty through various means. And after the Civil War, the area of Washington County continued to offer a relative protection to Black communities from the racial discrimination that was being employed by racial codes and other social norms in the federal city. And also, Corey alluded to this a little bit, but in a very public health sense, being away from the denser parts of Washington allowed them to survive many of the disease outbreaks that wiped out other Washingtonian familial lineages throughout that time. There was a cholera outbreak, which we believe is also the reason that George Pointer passed away, but many of his descendants were able to escape being taken out by that outbreak. And so that the experience of coming from such a strong lineage that perhaps isn't available or far-reaching in terms of documents for many other Black Washingtonian families, that was also taken from them. And we argue that that is just as impactful, if not more, than the material loss of their property. And that's exactly why our project tried to capture in our resulting report. Our project tried to capture both the tangible or material harms that were incurred, as well as the intangible harms, which we called spiritual harms. Material harms included the loss of access to the value of the land, but also access to self-determination due to the lack of economic independence. These two families were farming on their land, both for self-sustenance, but also to sell those cash crops. And so the separation from their property is not just separation from home, it's also the separation from like economic viability. Some of the intangible harms included the fragmentation of family, the loss of sacred space, and importantly, also the loss of historical heritage. And part of why we think that that's important to, and community, as someone is saying in the chat, part of the reason that we believe that this is so important to highlight is that liberation and the practice of liberty, like any other which constitutes human behavior, it's one that has to be learned and whose experience is influenced by what is being passed down through generations. And as such, strong families where children have access to their grandparents' support, where they have access to familial community in a very tangible way, that's historically the mechanism by which Black and Brown families and communities have survived in all times and still today. So targeting their homes, the place where they are rooted into the systems where they can inherit the generational knowledge and experience to successfully maneuver liberty, that's a sure way to destroy communities from the inside out. It is indeed an act of violence. It can have the same results as the displacement that we're seeing caused by the bombing of cities and neighborhoods in Ukraine, except that this form of violence is insidious, it's silent. And in the case of this family, it was deliberate, state-sponsored, community-driven violence that was predicated on the folklore of white supremacy, and that was supported by formal and informal policy decisions. It was racism that motivated neighbors in the burgeoning Chevy Chase neighborhood to organize and lobby federal officials to move towards building Lafayette Elementary School at that specific location. Through the weaponization of the process of eminent domain, combined with racially restrictive covenants, this community that preceded Chevy Chase Land Company by at least 50 years was forced to leave their land and were dispersed throughout DC and other cities in Maryland, New York, up and down the East Coast. So these actions were not benign. They had very real, material, and intangible harms. And further, this particular instance at Lafayette Elementary School is one example within a pattern of designating public spaces in the heart of what were once thriving African-American communities. The school, Duke Ellington School, former Western High School, that has a similar history, Deal Elementary School, former Wilson, now Jackson Reed High School, and other spaces like Malcolm X Park, the National Cemetery. Those were freedmen villages as well. And so all of this to say that through our investigation that was led through historical research and oral histories, we've been able to articulate an argument for harms incurred by systemic racism. And to understand this, we need to only look at the case of our two descendant narrators, the families that they belong to. We interviewed the great-great-grandchildren of Mary Harris Moten, who is pictured here on the left in a Washington Post article from 1928. And we learned that despite that their family having been a very tight-knit family, there's a lot of records going back and forth. As we said, Mary Harris Plummer, she kind of navigated her family after the death of her mom. And yet we learned that despite that history of closeness, in today's generation, there were two sets of cousins, which up until 10 years ago, they didn't know that they lived like almost across the street from each other. They didn't know that they were related, and that they didn't know that they were connected to this deep familial heritage in Washington, DC. And so part of our measuring of intangible harms is to say that not only these families get separated from the economic value of their family, they also literally were separated from the familial ties and the historical heritage that they belong to. And you cannot pay someone for that. And that's part of why our recommendations include not just compensatory forms of reparations, which I feel like is the most familiar form of reparations that people are used to hearing about, but also other forms, including the correcting of historical narratives, and also education. And like as we were saying, spreading awareness of the increasing of public education about their family's history and the amazing stories of survival, of triumph, and yes, of loss that they had in the history of their family. All of that in the face of a system that was set up to keep them from experiencing freedom to its fullest, like this can be a form of reparations too. I want everyone here to understand how powerful that is. That the fact that all of us are sitting here today talking about this, that the fact that you all have made time to learn about this history, that's another thread in the fabric of reparations towards this family, and in the fabric of reparations that these families have defined for themselves. And so what we're ultimately asking you is to join us in this effort to help us bring the story of these two families, of their stories of triumph, and also the ways in which systems of inequity were set up to bring their current day situations to reality into the classrooms, not just for their sake, but also it's important to consider when we have minority students who come from historically underrepresented communities, they need to know the story of Caroline Brennan. They need to know the story of George Pointer, because it's difficult to envision a path for yourself if you don't know the past triumphs of past generations. And so this is why, another reason why we make an argument for education being an incredible tool for reparations and for equity into the future, because allowing people to understand more complete historical narratives is a vehicle by which to attain a more equitable future. And for that, Corey is going to explain for you all really quickly where we based our conceptualization of reparations, which is ultimately centered in the international human rights framework.
Yeah, thank you. So reparations for us is centered, as Mariana said, in the international human rights framework. For reference purposes, we fall back to two key texts. The first is a report that was initially published in 2019 by the International Commission of Jurists. The second is a resulting United Nations resolution that adopts that report as a sustainable framework for achieving reparations. The premise is that reparations is due in instances of gross human rights violations. In the case of the Harrises and the Shorters, we have several immaterial and tangible harms. For today, we've chosen to focus on two. First is the loss of familial connection, and in turn, the erasure of history. For 3 generations, Dry Meadows served as a hub for the Shorters and the Harrises. Children often return to tend to the lands over the years as their parents age. The seizure of their lands effectively destroyed the gathering place for a family unit. And as a direct result, relatives who were once able to reliably return to the family acreages in Dry Meadows, knowing that they had a home and a source of income, were left scattered across the country. To address this, we focused on 2 elements of the larger framework as our focus for the near future. The first is satisfaction. Satisfaction is a broad category that, among other things, includes truth-telling and the accurate teaching of history. It is a means of revising a distorted historical narrative with the aim of achieving the second element, which is guarantees of non-repetition. Among the recommendations in this category of repair is institutional reform. Right? This would be not just fighting against housing discrimination, but also ensuring that there are institutional reforms in the way of legislation and public policy to prevent something like this from taking place again. While most of the literature is focused on judicial reforms as it relates to guarantees of non-repetition, we maintain that failing to study the past results in the same issues in the future. And it's in that spirit that we're here with you all today.
So in summary, the landscape of Chevy Chase, DC, it's no accident. It's the result of systematic and state-sponsored racial discrimination coupled with deliberate efforts to remove and restrict African Americans from certain neighborhoods and spaces. And today, it's our responsibility to grapple with that history and also to shepherd the next generation into learning how to grapple with that history responsible. So we leave you all with this question: how can we effectively engage students and community with that history in a way that is reparative? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that we can have a bit of that large group discussion. I will start by answering one of the questions that I see in the chat of have we shared this information to the students and teachers involved in schools like Lafayette Elementary School. And indeed, we have partnered with Linda Ryden, who is the peace teacher at Lafayette Elementary School, and she helped us provide 2 presentations thus far, one in 2020, another in last year in 2022. And we have committed to going back to Lafayette Elementary School later this spring to provide another set of presentations, and importantly, to bring some of the descendants back to the land. I will share that one of the takeaways from our presentation last spring was that there was a 3rd grade class, which was so inspired by learning this history that they had requested that the vegetable garden on campus be renamed Mary Harris's Vegetable Garden. And through that, sort of invoke the legacy of the history of this land and the family that used to live on the land. And I think, again, that's another example in the ways in which increasing public awareness about historical narratives inspires people to connect more meaningfully with their communities, but also allows communities themselves to engage in reparative efforts that go beyond the efforts that are being done by the project itself. And I think that's one of the reasons, again, why we are so inspired by or so adamant about inspiring younger generations to engage with this history, because as we mentioned, this is a lot of the history present in Chevy Chase, DC, is also the history that shaped a lot of the what were initially called the trolley cart suburbs in Washington, so those outside of the federal city, including Petworth, neighborhoods like that. And so part of our goal too is to let people know, sort of plant the seeds in some ways, and have students begin to investigate what is the history of their neighborhoods, what is and through that be able to understand, again, like why their communities look a certain way. So I guess with that, are there any questions from the audience? Any takeaways? We're really opening up the floor here for us to engage in this discussion.
I will say I want to sort of vocally acknowledge the comment in the chat about third graders get it. In a world where third graders can grapple with this sort of history, there's really no excuse why we can't make progress. That truly is sort of the testament, I think, for us, is even if the kids can get it, right, then we can start to have these conversations over generations, which is really the goal.
Exactly. And two, we tried to do this at every presentation that we give related to this history. And I want to make sure that we do it before we close out this session. For those of us who are engaged in participatory action research, particularly when we're engaged with such research in communities that have been traditionally harmed, or it's important that you question whether doing this research, doing this work brings undue exposure into such communities. For us, in that evaluation and understanding the risk that comes with historical erasure, we actually believe that it's important to name the current day descendants that we have worked with, and as a way to not just uplift the legacies that they come from, but also as a way for people to use those names as access points into their greater familial histories. So at this point too, I just want to mention a huge thank you to James Fisher, Shirley Turner, Jocelyn Julian, Karen Kellebrew, Angela Ivey, Tadachia Gregory, Susan Willoughby, and our mama who keeps us all together, Tanya Hardy, and a huge thank you to them for their trust in this endeavor, and sharing their vulnerability, and also being like true partners in helping us envision what a more equitable future looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So seeing some, folks want to see the QR code. I am happy to reshare that so that you can access it. And then Julia, I'll make sure to send a copy of this presentation to you so that we can share it with session attendees as well.
Wonderful, thank you.
Just trying to get to the.
While you're doing that, I want to respond to Vinny's comment in the chat. Oftentimes, what I find in predominantly white spaces, the obstacle to exploring these kinds of histories through a paradigm that is looking towards the future, right? Like, what do we do now? Is that people, and Mariana and I had this conversation, I think, last night. People sort of resort to, well, we don't know anybody anything. Right. And the response that I have to that is, discussing history has nothing to do with what you know and everything to do with what you can do. Right. there's not necessarily an obligation to do anything, right? But I think as a first step, right, if we're all well-intentioned human beings that really are trying to work towards a more perfect union, right, the first step in that journey is to just tell the story, right? Regardless of whether you're using sort of the reparations framework or not. There's a book that was written on the history of the Harris family. Get that book and show it to the kids. and you know, eventually they engage with that history on their own. And the hope, right, is that eventually they start to have the conversations themselves about, you know, how do we make things right? What can we do, right? Not what do we owe, but what can we do?
And just to point folks to that book that Corey is talking about is Between Freedom and Equality, by Barbara Torrey and Tiggy Green, or Clara Green. Proceeds from this book are actually being compiled in a fund, which will be made available to the descendants, and they will have the authority to decide what happens with those funds. And that's, again, another strategy within the model of reparations that we've been advocating for, is that descendants have full control and authority over what happens with any of the funds that are generated from the telling of their story. And it seems, Vinny, you said you were wanting to ask a question over the microphone. Feel free to unmute.
Thank you. It's just hard to get it all out for me with typing. I will certainly get this book for myself. They're 9, so I don't know that they're really ready for 300 pages in general. But I guess a lot of this is my analysis, and I feel like the part that I can do with my students is there is so much segregation and isolation in our communities in DC. And I really want to break that down as much as I can. And maybe I need to sort of like step that back and let them do the analysis of what we can do. But for me, it's like, this is part of our legacy. And especially as people of privilege, it's part of our legacy. Well, maybe not especially, but like, I want them to especially know that because they're people of privilege. And that I don't want them to just take it and be like, oh, well, that was sad. Like, I really want to have it be more than a thinking about the past, but also to have it thinking about the future.
For sure. And, you know, as we were mentioning, understanding, for example, the role of racially restrictive covenants, maybe they're too young to like understand like those complex policy processes, but I think they're not too young to understand fairness and like equal access to space. So like there are ways in which we can sort of bring these topics down to levels that students of all ages can understand. And, you know, to answer another question as well that I saw in the chat of like, have we gotten any pushback from this version of history? I think that like that's been the most, I guess, like challenging part of this work, is that the more people that you do outreach to, the more people that you also get who are coming back, as Corey was saying, who say, I don't owe it. Like, as a resident of Chevy Chase, DC, I don't owe anybody anything. I moved into this neighborhood 20 years ago, you know, something like that. And it wasn't any of my decision. But that doesn't mean that those communities are still not able to benefit from the ways in which restricting African Americans back in the 20th century from these spaces then allowed property values to rise to a certain level. Also, like, beyond the property values, the sort of social value that a space like Chevy Chase, DC has within, and also the political power that a neighborhood like that has. So putting all of these things into perspective allows us to appreciate that maybe current day residents didn't have anything to do with that decision, but it doesn't mean that they're not able to benefit because of the dynamics that were set by that decision. And again, it's the responsibility of all of us, not just Black and Brown residents of Chevy Chase, DC, to grapple with that history, amplify that history, and like, again, begin to grapple with the question of not what do I owe, but what do we do from here? And then also eventually, hopefully, ideally get to the point of like, what do I owe? Because there is that as well, right? Great. Okay, so I know that we're coming up on time. Really appreciate everyone here for joining us. I hope that this inspires folks to investigate the history of the communities that you're all residing in, whether it's Washington, D.C. We also know that a lot of these histories have been replicated in cities like New York, Chicago, and really all Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas. So this is really part of a pattern of the ways in which spaces have been delineated in the United States as a whole. So we invite you to investigate what that looks like. And if we can ever be of any support, you feel free to email us at blackbroadbranch@gmail.com, and certainly make use of the resources that we put together in that QR code. We hope to also pretty soon be able to publish the DCPS standard curricula that we have been developing.
Thank you so much, Mariana and Corey and Shannon and Drew, our ASL interpreters.